If you don't have time to explore the whole website, we wanted to give you just a little bit of some of the key learnings that we learned from this experiment. But I do encourage you to look at the various pieces up in the menu bar for lots more information. But when this project started, I was serving as pastor of two of our churches part time, and it made sense to connect those two. We'd already had good connections among the pastors of all the churches in this cluster, and so we thought, well, what would a more formal, kind of systematic way of working together look like? And since I was preaching in both places, we thought that seems like a natural place. So we started to try some events and some ways to connect those two congregations. And we had a lot of fun and it was great, but it never sort of clicked. And then during COVID, things got real hard. Obviously, that was not part of what we expected. But we did have the infrastructure laid then between those two churches to do online worship together, which was great. And then also to share resources and ideas for drive in worship, for online among all the other churches. And I think it's hard for me to imagine what that worship experience during the lockdown would have been like if we didn't have this community connected. So we'd thought about those two churches in particular getting together, and I think one of the big learnings from this has been the role of deacons. So in the ELCA, we have two rosters of ministry. One is the ministers of Word and Sacrament, which is pastors like me, and then also the ministers of Word and Service, which are deacons. And their call is really to have one foot inside the church and one foot out in the community, and help bridge both worlds together. So to bring the world into the church and the church into the world. And most deacons I know really take seriously the understanding of the ministry of all of God's people, or we call the ministry of the baptized. And that is that when you're baptized, you are ordained as a minister, not in a priestly sense, but in whatever way it is that God is calling you. And so having deacons be part of this was really important. And when Deacon Lee joined on and really started directing things, I think that's really what took us to a new level. Even though I'm someone who takes the priesthood of all believers and the ministry of all God's people seriously, in my head as a pastor, I still think about churches and about the institution and the structures. And one of the things Deacon Lee did, and our connection with deacons in general, was to move the focus away from what institutions can do together and much more to a grassroots level. The kind of questions Lee was asking were, what are you called to? And what gifts are you as individuals given by God? And how are you called to use those? We started there rather than kind of from a structural level, but going back to more to the grassroots and inviting people to connect where they felt called to connect, to discover new callings that they hadn't imagined before, to be equipped for things that they felt called to do but didn't know how to do that, and to share resources, lay leader to lay leader. And I think that's the secret to most of what we learned in this, rather than thinking from the pastor level and the church level, but thinking about the interconnections between the people. So the ministry of deacons has been really important to us, and it's not, it's just emerging in the ELCA for what role are deacons to play. And I'm more and more convinced that I think deacons have a major role to play in leading the church forward, to get us out of our silos, to get us out of thinking just about our own church communities and thinking about our neighborhoods and about our other partners at churches and other organizations. And if there's anything that we learned from that I would say that is key, is to really go to the leaders, where people are at, what they feel called to, and how it is that they want to live out their ministry in new and different ways. The other big piece that we learned was about the importance of connecting. So these churches, many of them had been in this valley for 100 years. The families were all interconnected. People had moved back and forth, and yet somehow each of our little churches was pretty isolated. We did our own thing. We had our own Sunday schools. We had our own things. And when times were good, especially in the middle of the 20th century, that seemed to work pretty well. Everybody was booming. Everything, things were just working out. We had plenty to do on our own. But in the latter half of the 20th century, latter years of the 20th century, and then the beginning of the 21st, the situation changed. Our churches shrunk, our resources dwindled, changes in society and in young people today. We just weren't the same kind of communities that we were before. And for all of us, it got harder and harder to live out the ministries that we felt called to. And so many of us just looked more and more inward. And one of the things we learned in this experience when we got people together was to just compare our struggles, that we were all experiencing shrinking congregation, that we worried about the lack of youth and families, or the few that we had wouldn't, how will we serve the folks that we do have? We knew that we were part of a bigger church, the Northwest Washington Synod and the ELCA and Lutheranism around the world, and yet felt pretty isolated. We had these walls between us. We learned that we had similar struggles, and I think a huge one was that we don't need to be in competition with each other. There is enough ministry to be done. There is enough people in the world longing for God, looking for a kind of transformative experience, wanting to be part of something that if we can collaborate together, we'll actually be stronger together. That has continued. And that's something that will outlive this project, is to really shift our thinking away from our congregation and what we're doing, and thinking about what is God up to in this whole community, and how can we serve and be a part of it. And this congregation might be good at that, and this congregation might be good at that, or there's a couple of leaders at various churches that are excited about something like the One Parish, One Prisoner program. Or how do we connect a nonprofit, Link Northwest, into the work of this whole area, not owned by one church, but something we can all contribute to. We really started to shift into what we think is a new model of ministry, away from independent and introverted, really isolated churches, and thinking more about how can we be collaborative and connected and relational. And again, I think the calling of our deacons to lead us into that, I hope that's one of the outcomes for the future. Now, we don't know what the end result of this is going to be. You know, when we dreamed this up, we thought maybe we could call a deacon for the cluster, that all the churches could pitch in and we would share a staff person like we did during the grant-funded part of that. But that wasn't a reality. The situation with COVID and our continued challenges as churches, there just weren't resources for that like we thought there would be. But we know that there is something more going, and the lay leaders networks that we've built are strong, and they're building and they're growing. They continue to meet for Bible study. They continue to meet to study and equip each other with people from the various congregations together. And I think what this project really was a seed that was planted in some really fertile soil, and we just don't know what the end result is going to be. But I think it's going to come out of those lay leaders. My hunch when I look down the road 5, 10, 15 years is that one day we'll look back and say, you know, this never would have happened if we hadn't had those connections that we started way back when through this project. Maybe one of our churches has a crisis and closes, or maybe we decide we're going to share a pastor together, or maybe our sort of informal confirmation network becomes something that really connects to youth of our community. I just don't know at this point, but I'm excited to see how these seeds that we've planted, these relationships that we've built, how God's going to use them to bear fruit in the future. That's a real quick summary of all that we learned, and I invite you in the menu. You'll find our culminating event where we really process through this and a lot more, and you'll hear from more voices than me, from the actual voices of the leaders in our community. So check that page out, and again, let us know if you have any questions or if you'd like to know more, and we're glad to accompany you as you do a similar experiment. So thanks for listening. I hope you've learned something and will continue to, and God bless you on your ministry adventures and experiments as well.